Scrapyard Dog, released in 1990 or 91 depending on the source for the Atari 7800 Pro system courtesy of the Atari Corporation and Blue Sky Software, was pretty much the only real traditional side-scrolling platformer on the console before the homebrew wave started to kick in. And yeah, talk about poor timing, right? Super Mario Bros. Was a thing in 1985 and helped to kickstart the Nintendo dynasty in North America. The side-scrolling platformer became the norm during this time and had evolved significantly over the years. New consoles with extra bits such as the TurboGrafx-16 and the Sega Genesis had graced the scene, with Super Nintendo not that far off in the distance. And along comes Atari to put out this rather quaint little platformer on their Atari 7800 system that by that point was pretty much all but forgotten, which I'm sure made Atari fanboy Mark quite sad enough to jump ahead to the year 2084, where the world is taken over by Robotrons and everyone is pretty much dead, so he could resume the lovely fantasy of Atari still ruling the video game roast, or something to that extent. I gave up trying to keep up with the narrative ages ago. Anyway, Scrapyard Dog was Atari's attempt at capturing a piece of that Mario platforming pie, and as fate would have it, Scrapyard Dog would end up being the final official release to grace the Atari 7800 before its discontinuation a year or so later. Unless you lived in Europe, then you got Sentinel as a 7800 swan song. So not only was it a matter of too little too late, but Scrapyard Dog as a game in and of itself really isn't all that great. Now, in fairness, Scrapyard Dog did eventually get a release on Atari's short-lived Lynx handheld system, and that's actually a far better game than what you had on the 7800, but it's also a far different game than what you had on the earlier console. Both versions are available on the Atari 50 compilation, which is what we're playing here today, and while I will gladly give Scrapyard Dog for the Lynx a hearty recommendation if you're looking for some platforming fun, the same cannot be said for its Atari 7800 original. Anyway, you control Louie, a junkyard owner who must rescue your dog Scraps from the clutches of the evil Mr. Big. Why does Mr. Big want Scraps? Who knows? Who cares? He's a dick. Simple as that. Scrapyard Dog has you traversing 6 worlds, each comprising 3 areas: the junkyard, the city streets, and the sewers. After which you return to a new junkyard level and the cycle continues until the last world, which houses Mr. Big's lair. Louie can stomp on enemies to kill them, much like Super Mario. Doing so will cause enemies to drop items like money bags and cans, the latter of which will provide Louie with limited ammunition to off foes from a distance. Louie can enter certain doors or recycling bins for hidden shops to purchase items, or even bonus rooms that you can get hidden items, or sometimes you'll come across a giant piano where you have to replay a melody in order to gain money bags. An increasingly difficult task that gets more difficult as you progress further into the game and simply isn't worth the reward. Controlling Louie is simple on paper at least. One button jumps and the other throws the cans. As Louie moves, he gains speed, and the more speed you build, the farther your leaps become, which becomes key to progressing in Scrapyard Dog. My issue here is that the jumping feels incredibly wonky, and Louie does have a bit of a slippery feel in terms of overall control, which makes some of the more precise platforming segments somewhat more challenging than intended. This constant need to build up speed in order to extend your leaps means you'll need to take on many leaps of faith as you have to clear wide gaps that sometimes are perhaps a bit too wide. Making matters worse is that Scrapyard Dog only scrolls to the right, much like Super Mario Bros. 1, which means not only do you have leaps of faith that require you to build up speeds to achieve successfully, but if you move too far ahead and lack sufficient room to build up speed, you can't scroll backwards and are thus screwed. Part of what makes for a good platformer is good platforming controls, as well as smart level design suited for those controls, and Scrapyard Dog falters a bit in both regards. I also found collision detection to be somewhat spotty at times as well, as sometimes an enemy sprite will miss you by a hair but still register as a hit. It doesn't help that the game seemingly throws things your way at random, with little time to react sometimes, forcing you to take a hit if you're running really fast. Now, Louie can go into shops hidden throughout the game to acquire extra items like screen-clearing bombs or shields that act as extra hit points, but shops only sell one item at a time. Despite some of the issues I have with controls and general level design, Scrapyard Dog is still somewhat playable to a degree once you get around its quirks, and it does feature mid-level checkpoints, and continues, so you're not completely starting from scratch whenever you lose a life. I just wish there was more tightening to the controls, less leaps of faith, and less of a tossing shit to a wall and seeing what stick approach in terms of enemy and obstacle placement. Scrapyard Dog isn't a bad-looking game, nowhere near the quality of its platforming contemporaries, but still a charming little title on the 700 at least. The scrolling is silky smooth, the characters are nicely drawn, animation's fairly smooth for the most part, and while the backdrops are somewhat dull-looking, they're at least not ugly to look at, I'll give them that much. I do have to knock points for instances where the level-ending phone booth will appear seconds out of nowhere once you've reached the end of a level. Normally they're supposed to already be there waiting, but whatever. It happens rarely, I'll give them a pass in this regard. It looks fine otherwise. Scrapyard Dog's sound output, on the other hand, is somewhat lacking. Yes, this is stock 7800 sound that's based on old 2600 sound processing, so it's naturally going to be rough sounding. The music playing in the background are simple, basic melodies played with simple, basic instrumentation, so as to not sound too grating on the ears, but it's also quite bland, and these repeat for each themed segment. Sound effects are basic, inoffensive, and functional, the most you could ask for from vintage sound processing on Atari. Well, it took a while, but Scrapyard Dog finally gave Atari 7800 owners something resembling a contemporary side-scrolling platformer that had been a fixture on other consoles of the day. Unfortunately, by 1990, it was not only too little too late to actually be worth a damn, but the game itself proves to be rather underwhelming due to wonky controls and jumping physics, as well as a lack of backtracking and an insistence on blind leap of faith platforming challenges. Scrapyard Dog is still largely playable if you're willing to put up with its quirks, but it's not going to be a fun time, and compared to what was available elsewhere, you're not really missing out on much. Regardless, Scrapyard Dog is available on Atari 50, and it's probably the most convenient means of playing this game since the original card costs a pretty penny these days. Same time, however, Atari 50 also has the far superior Lynx version, which is probably the version you should be playing anyway, so yeah, good try, boy, but no treat for you. Sorry.